But really, Artem and I just have a few questions, kind of really about the chapter you wrote, kind of your ideas behind it.
Sure.
We
And,
both
and maybe a good place to start is just maybe we all introduce ourselves because just to make sure we're all on the same page here. I can start. My name is Artem Refiev. I'm a first year graduate student here in the HESA program at University of South Carolina, and I'm currently a graduate assistant at the conduct office. So nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah, and so I've been on Zoom interviews this whole week, and I always forget to introduce myself. So thank you, Artem. I always forget to. But my name is Ryan Edmonds. I am a second year in this program. This is my last semester. I'll be almost finished up, but I currently am a graduate assistant for the Student Success Center. So I oversee supplemental instruction, which is an academic support program here on campus. And yeah, I'm in the class with Artem, and we have the privilege of reviewing your chapter.
Great. Yeah, let me just introduce myself then. I'm Marc VanOverbeke. I'm the interim dean. We are starting the first round of dean interviews today, so that's why it's been a little bit hectic. I'm also the associate dean for academic affairs and professor in ed policy studies and history of education social foundation. So wearing multiple hats right now. So this is kind of nice to be able to pop back into the world that I wanted to be in initially through by going to grad school and wanting to be a professor and do research. So thanks for reaching out and setting this up.
Yeah, absolutely. I know both Ryan and I really did enjoy your chapter in the soon to be published book. So, that's just it was very interesting, and if anything, so relevant to kind of what's been going on in the past year, past what at this point, couple of years here in America, and if anything, the history of this country, right? And if anything, just to, is it all right if I address you as Marc?
Yeah, please do.
Perfect. So Ryan, did you want to maybe start off our questions?
Yeah, absolutely. We don't have a ton because we know your time is valuable, but really, so both of us kind of, I will preface, both of us kind of took a little bit of different approaches towards when we wrote our analysis of it. I'll kind of talk about mine. I'll let Artem talk about his before we do the questions, but I was definitely kind of looking at how Black athletes were able to use protesting as a means of social reform, kind of then connected with events at San Jose State College, and then connected that through other historic events, whether that was through professional athletes or other collegiate athletes over the years. And that's kind of where I aimed at it. And I also looked at a little bit on Black athletes' well-being and how they can be like economically exploited through those means.
And for me, kind of after reviewing the chapter, I focused more on kind of the administration side of universities and how administration responds to student protests, and kind of given the situations that you addressed, it seemed that was a focal point, a tipping point for a university response. And I kind of referenced some recent athletic protests at the University of Missouri a few years ago, and so kind of relating that current, more recent situation to the historic ones at San Jose. So that's kind of maybe our two different approaches and where our questions will be coming from.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
So I guess really starting off is, I guess, thinking, I'm sure you probably did your research before doing the chapter, and kind of now since you've written it, like the question we kind of thought about was like, what do you think Harry Edwards would say today with the events that have occurred since then?
It's a good question. We could probably ask him. And I know that there have been some reminiscence in looking backwards, and people have reached out to him to ask him what he would say about a number of issues today. This is one of the questions sort of at the heart of history is, trying to think about what it tells us about the present, but also not wanting to trace that too far down the road because contexts are so different today. But I suspect that he would say exactly what you've been saying, that there are some very specific parallels. And part of, as I've been thinking about, well, as a quick aside, one thing that you said before is how administrators have dealt with a lot of the protests. And I was kind of impressed by how San Jose and President Clark there dealt with a lot of them in ways that at San Francisco, they just completely went in a different direction. And you can see two very different approaches, and one ends in a strike and the other ends in a lot more, I think, more constructive attitudes. But I always wondered when I was doing the research, how I would respond if I were president or an administrator.
Mm-hmm.
And then it turns out that in this role as being the interim dean, I faced a very similar situation. And so I learned exactly how I would have to respond. So I think Harry Edwards would probably say that athletics remains very much a powerful force and an instrument not just for changing the world, but also one that needs to be changed itself. And with the protests in Missouri and other places, we see that athletes continue to use sport to protest larger movements, but also just to demand change within sport. You can look at Atlanta right now in Georgia and Major League Baseball and the conflict between Major League Baseball moving out of, or at least holding some games outside of Atlanta. And then I think it was yesterday, the governor of Texas said, well, I'm not going to have anything to do with MLB because they moved the games out of Atlanta in protest of the Georgia voting laws. So it's all very much there. I don't want to speak for Harry Edwards, so let's ask him, but I'd be curious to know what he has to say.
No, absolutely. And it's definitely interesting to see how and that's kind of like what led into another question I thought of, is that it definitely is becoming not so much a norm, but it's been very more frequently that we are seeing like students and professional athletes using their platform as a means for reform or some form of silent protesting. But what would you think would be like the next big, I guess, surprise? Because I feel like it's becoming a little bit of a normal and frequent event. But do you think there will be another way for athletes, whether at the collegiate or professional level, to kind of take that further?
I think we're going to see, and I'm just speculating here, and I look at the past. You want to ask me things, if you ask me questions about sports and athletics today, I'm going to know next to nothing. Yeah. I know the Cubs played yesterday just down the block from where I live, but my sport knowledge of current events is kind of limited. So take everything I say with a grain of salt. But I think what we're seeing right now, especially with the Supreme Court, seems more willing to take a look at whether athletes are employees and whether they should be paid. And that's only going to get bigger and bigger. But depending on what the Supreme Court says, we may see athletics more heavily involved in labor disputes and athletes getting more involved in employer-labor disputes and interactions. It may spill over to Amazon. Right now, there's a huge unionizing drive within Amazon. That's right now a huge deal for collegiate sports, and it's quite possible that there'll be that connection that people will make between collegiate sports and larger union organizing drives. I wouldn't be surprised to see that at all. Yeah. And for many, that is going to also be within what we saw in the 1960s around a civil rights dispute and around civil rights issues and racial justice.
No, absolutely. And I think that also opens up other implications to that. If especially in the college level, if students can definitely have a financial gain from their athletic ability, how does that lead to how even high school students are perceiving whether or not they want to go to a college? And when does that look like? What college can they go to? Are they going to more likely choose colleges that can offer them the most money, as not just as scholarships, but as most money to make in terms of employability? And kind of what does that look like for like collegiate recruitment, especially at smaller or maybe private institutions?
And even to add to that is, if you're kind of seeing student athletes as employees, if they're protesting, is that a reasoning for like employee termination or like what is the, you're opening a Pandora's box there kind of with this, continued conversation of the the rights of student athletes and whether or not they should get paid. And kind of going back a little bit to a point you were making, as I mentioned, a lot of my questions are kind of on the administrative role and kind of that aspect of student protest. And so to maybe ask very bluntly is, how important is an administrator's role at a university in handling student athlete protests, and maybe from a historical sense, and also maybe in a direct sense of maybe from your own experience as you mentioned.
It can consume administrators. Athletics in general can consume administrators. I'm sure you see that every day on your campus. The University of Illinois Chicago here is interesting because we don't have a football team. We have a basketball team, we have a baseball team, we have gymnastics, we have lots of the other sports, but we don't have the big time football. And we don't even have small time football. So, UIC is an interesting place, but before I came to UIC, I was at Northern Illinois University, and that's what got me sort of interested in this topic, is because they were really using sport, in particularly football, as a way to build their reputation. And once you start to do that, whether it was, San Jose was using football and sport to build its reputation. If we also stay in California, we look at Sacramento. Sacramento State in 1957 didn't have a football team. The college was just a few years old, and the students protested for football. They said, we have to have a football team because we're not a real college if we don't have a football team. So, once you give football that prevalence on a campus to either recruit students or build reputations, then it's very easy to just give football everything it wants. And it's very easy then to ignore the scandals that are inevitably going to come, because the scandals always came. They came at Sacramento. It doesn't matter. No matter how well-intentioned you are, there's always going to be something that happens around football that's going to raise the public's concern and scandal. So it goes both ways. And you have to be, administrators have to be very careful about that. I don't deal with that in my role. I deal with a different level of student protest, but not around athletics. But once you go down the road of using athletics to build a campus and to build a university, then it's, where do you say no? And then you see these debates about, are these athletes students or are they players? And then you get into these debates that seemed kind of silly today, but they were debates where an English professor was up in arms because the football player got to register for his course before the other students got to register for his course. Today, we probably wouldn't think a whole lot about that, but that was one example in the 1950s where faculty thought that football was getting out of hand, where athletics, big time athletics, was getting out of hand, because these athletes had privileges. But of course, if you're going to recruit athletes, they're going to play the market in some ways. They're smart enough to do it. So they're going to want those privileges. And if you really want to build a team, you're going to give those privileges in some way. And then once you start having to pay athletes, and probably only certain athletes, then the competition is going to be even more demanding and dramatic. And I don't know a president who's going to be able to do anything except manage athletics. I think that's ultimately the challenge.
If anything, just thank you for your time today.
That's good. No, it's always nice to be able to do this. So it's a nice change of pace in my day. So I really appreciate this.
Awesome. Well, I hope everyone. Well, I'll see Art. We actually have our athletic class here in a little bit, so I'll see Artem in a few minutes. But I hope you enjoy the rest of your Tuesday. And we appreciate your time, Marc.
Sounds good.
Awesome.